Hi, welcome to my channel. Let's pick up where we left off. I was talking about Jung's conception of the shadow archetype and how we can, as writers, use it to make stronger characters and, therefore, more captivating stories. I'm going to place a link to that previous video in the description below. Today I'm going to discuss, and this is point number 4 carried on from last day, why should we care about the shadow? And point number 5, how can the shadow make one's life go better or worse? And naturally the focus is going to be more on characters than people, real people, but that is the roadmap, that is my intention. Just so we're all on the same page, briefly, Jung describes the shadow as follows. The personal unconscious corresponds to the figure of the shadow so frequently met with in dreams. That was from the Red Book. He also says, by shadow, I understand the negative side of the personality, the sum of all those hidden unpleasant qualities, the insufficiently developed functions, and the contents of the personal unconscious. Jung describes this phase of the individuation process as the encounter with the shadow, and that's also from the Red Book. Now we can start to answer the question, why should we, as writers, care about the shadow? First, arguably, our characters, like us, should be interested in keeping themselves alive. 4a. So, self-preservation. Jung warns that if a person, or character, keeps projecting her faults onto others, she will eventually wander about in a false world, one populated by creatures spun from her imagination. Chilling. I'm sure we've all met people like this. Folks who have lied to themselves for so long they believe the false stories they have spun for themselves, but it seems to have a cumulative effect, and lies keep getting bigger, and the person's faith in them becomes stronger until, finally, they are dangerously detached from reality. That's dangerous for themselves and dangerous for others. Jung writes, the effect of projection is to isolate the subject from his environment, since instead of a real relation to it, there is now only an illusory one. Projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face. In the last analysis, therefore, they lead to a condition in which one dreams a world whose reality remains forever unattainable. The resultant sentiment, and the still worse feeling of sterility, are in their own turn explained by projection as the malevolence of the environment, and by means of this vicious circle, the isolation is intensified. Just in writing that out, I have a great idea for my next big bad, or maybe the nemesis. Actually, let's talk a little bit about each of those character types. If we have the big bad suppress the shadow, then this could be both a short-term weakness and a strength. Perhaps short-term, his lies help to give him the confidence he needs to influence people, to win their trust. But in the long run, it is the hero's willingness to face uncomfortable truths about himself that helps him win the day. Nemesis. On the other hand, if we decided to have the nemesis repress his shadow, we would create a character who is almost exactly like the hero in all significant ways but one. The nemesis represses his shadow where the hero is honest. Honest with others, honest with himself. By the way, if you want to read more about the big bad and the nemesis, head over to the website tvtropes.com. I'll put a link to it in the description below. Okay, here's another reason why we, or at least our characters, should want to integrate our shadow. Namely, they will come to know themselves better. Self-awareness. In other words, by integrating our shadow, we will not only stop projecting our faults onto others, but become more aware of ourselves, of our own needs. Jung writes, emotion, incidentally, is not an activity of the individual, but something that happens to him. If we can let go of the projection, then that allows the hero to understand something she previously didn't. I think that's just so profound. Emotion is not an activity of the individual, but something that happens to him. And when I think about that, that's how I experience it. The few times I've been mad, it's not as though I decided to be mad, or I had the thought that I wanted to be mad, or I willed myself to be mad. You're just angry. Like someone steps on your toe because they want to hurt you, and instantly anger. It's not something that feels as though it comes from the ego, comes from you. Anyway, moving on. In the above, I've looked at, if I could put it like this, the bright side of the shadow. Now let's look at, and this is point number 5, how can the shadow make one's life go better or worse? In a moment, we'll see how repressing one's shadow can make one's life go worse. But first, let's talk about how integrating it can make it go better. First, some terminology. One integrates one's shadow through the process of individuation. Essentially, one brings the contents of the shadow, those contents of the personal unconscious, into consciousness. So let's take a look at the process. Here's a definition of individuation I came across. Individuation is a process of transformation whereby the personal and collective unconscious are brought into consciousness, for example by means of dreams, active imagination, or free association, to be assimilated into the whole personality. It is a completely natural process necessary for the integration of the psyche. That definition was from Wikipedia, but I thought it did a good job of summing up what is a very complex subject. The idea is that to achieve the goal of being a whole person, one must become aware of the things that, to a large extent, determine our behavior. If we succeed, then we will become stronger and more able to take care of the inevitable difficulties of life. An integrated life, regardless of the particular situation one finds oneself in, is the best possible life given those circumstances. Now, let's take a look at how repressing one's shadow can make one's life go worse. So now we're at 5b. As Jung thought, where there is light, there is also darkness. So, as one would expect, integrating our shadow can go wrong in a number of ways. First, inflation and possession. These two seem very similar to me. Inflation is the unconscious identification with an image one has encountered in dreams, daydreams, and so on. For instance, when one integrates the shadow, then the images that flowed from it, these thoughts and feelings and impulses, become especially vivid, and it can be tempting to identify oneself with them, which would be bad. Imagine if the sum of your hidden unpleasant qualities were made clear to you, and that instead of being appalled, but realizing that they weren't the final word on who you were as a person, you identified yourself with them. For instance, let's say you realize that you've been projecting your own laziness onto your employees, but instead of feeling embarrassed and resolving to do better, you decide that, well, you're the boss. Why shouldn't they do all the work? After all, since you're a manager and have the power to fire them, you're better than them. Now, of course, that's not true, but I've known a couple of people who actually felt like this. And yes, they were horrible managers. Now, how could this apply to writing? If you gave this trait or quality to a character, it would be fairly easy to get your readers to dislike them. And you could also play it for comedy. Anyway, onward. Let's talk about another way that repressing the shadow can go bad for a character. Possession. Possession occurs where the ego is overwhelmed by the contents of the unconscious. Jung writes, "We now come to changes of personality which imply neither enlargement nor demutation, but a structural alteration. One of the most important forms is the phenomenon of possession. Some content, an idea, or a part of the personality obtains mastery of the individual for one reason or another. The contents which thus take possession appear as peculiar convictions, idiosyncrasies, stubborn plans, and so forth. As a rule, they are not open to correction. One has to be an especially good friend of the possessed person and willing to put up with almost anything if one is to attempt to deal with such a condition. A common instance of this is identity with the persona, which is the individual's system of adaptation to, or the manner he assumes in dealing with, the world. Every calling or profession, for example, has its own characteristic persona. So, for instance, think of the stereotypical writer, the stereotypical waiter. Some people, if you identify yourself with that, you fundamentally are a waiter, or you fundamentally are a lawyer, or you fundamentally are a doctor, and everything is funneled through that identity. Then you're identifying yourself with that persona, with that identity. Jung continues writing, "The danger is that they become identical with their personas, the professor with his textbook, the tenor with his voice. Then the damage is done. Henceforth he lives exclusively against the background of his own biography. For by that time it is written, then he went to such and such a place, and said this or that, etc. The garment of Delanira, I know I'm slaughtering that name, has grown fast to his skin. And a desperate decision like that of Hercules is needed if he is to tear this Nessus shirt from his body and step into the consuming fire of the flame of immortality in order to transform himself into what he really is. One could say with little exaggeration that the persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is. In any case, the temptation to be what one seems to be is great, because the persona is usually rewarded in cash." I love that. I thought that explanation was really interesting, especially the part about Delanira. I think it's Delanira. Anyway, I looked up the garment of Delanira, and she was a Chaldonian princess in Greek mythology whose name translated as man-destroyer. She was the wife of Hercules, and in late classical accounts, his unwitting murderer, killing him with the poisoned shirt of Nessus. The central story about... Okay, so A wild centaur named Nessus attempted to kidnap Delanira as he was ferrying her across the river, but she was rescued by Hercules, who shot the centaur with a poisoned arrow. As the centaur lay dying, Nessus persuaded Delanira to take a sample of his blood, telling her that a potion of it mixed with olive oil would ensure that Hercules would never again be unfaithful. Delanira believed his words and kept a little of the poison by her. Hercules fathered illegitimate children all across Greece and then fell in love with Ilo. When Delanira thus feared that her husband would leave her forever, she smeared some of the blood on Hercules' famous lion-skin shirt. Hercules' servant brought him the shirt and he put it on. The centaur's toxic blood burned Hercules, and eventually Hercules threw himself into a funeral pyre. In despair, Delanira committed suicide by hanging herself. Okay, very tragic story, but you can see what Jung was saying there, that the persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is. So the garment of Delanira has grown fast to Hercules' skin, so he can't take it off. And he makes the desperate decision to jump into the fire. And that's the only way that he can get the shirt off. So Jung is saying that Hercules decided to step into the consuming fire of the flame of immortality to burn off the imperfection so that he could transform himself into what he really is. And that's, in Jungian terms, that would be the process of individuation. Okay, I thought that was really interesting. To sum up this section, in order to thwart both inflation and possession from occurring, one needs an attitude of acceptance and honesty. Unfortunately, inflation of the ego and possession by the shadow aren't the only way things can go wrong. Of course not, right? Just as in life, we can't achieve something awesome and then just sit on our laurels. I can tell you from personal experience that if you lose 5 pounds and then go right back to eating oh-so-delicious hamburgers and perhaps bacon and eggs, where the bacon is thick sliced and crisp around the edges, I'm drooling. Anyway, where was I? It is easy for one's accomplishments to tarnish and fade. In Jungian terms, this is corruption. Now, a system will never reach equilibrium, or at least never reach it for long. One opposing pole will gain ascendancy followed by the other. That said, in terms of the shadow, the idea is to bring about a constant renewal by continually attending to and incorporating the elements of one's personal unconscious. For example, after I've lost 5 pounds, I don't want to give up exercising and sit on the couch snacking on bacon. It would be even worse if I did that and criticized all the thin, beautiful women on TV for being just a little bit pudgy. That would be projection. The appropriate way of dealing with this aspect of my shadow would be to be honest with myself about my desire to lose 5 pounds, set a realistic plan to accomplish that goal, and then use willpower to, mostly, stay on track and implement the plan. In the next video, I want to go through the relevant aspects of the hero's journey and use our understanding of the shadow archetype to aid us in creating our main characters. Okay, we're almost done this mini-series on the shadow. Just one more video and we're done. Thank you for watching. If you've gotten anything from this video, please like and subscribe. Whatever you do, have a great day and I'll talk to you later. Good writing.